The first thing we want to do before getting started lighting is we want to get our render settings up to a good spot here. So the render settings you can find up here at the top is going to be this little clipboard with a gear on it. So render settings is what you want to find. So click this, and then this window is going to show up. So the first thing you want to do is under render using the second tab here, it says Arnold Renderer. What you want to do is you want to change this to Maya software for this project. And now you'll see before there was a bunch of tabs here along this line, and now there are two. So we have Common and Maya software. So under Common, there are just two settings we want to change here to start off with. So we want to scroll down. We're going to ignore all this stuff, and we're going to go down to where it says HD 540. That is the image size that we'll be rendering out, and 960 by 540 is a pretty small setting, and so that can be okay for previews, but when it's time to export, that's going to be way too small. And so I'll just go ahead and show how to change that setting. So HD 1080 is a good setting. It's 1920 by 1080. There are many settings in here which are okay, or you can just type in your own custom setting if you would like. For this demo, HD 1080 will be good though. So that's the first of two things we want to change under this Common tab. The second thing we want to change is we want to go down to the very bottom under Render Options, and then change this. So there's a default light in the scene, and we want to disable that. That default light, I'm going to leave it on here and demo it for a second. So I'm going to just click this button right here. It's the clipboard with the eye on it on the very left. So before we hit render settings, and then to do a render, we're going to click this button right here. It's going to bring up the render view window, which we're going to be using a lot here today. And then it's this button right here that you want to click to render the current frame. So on the very left, that clipboard. You'll notice that that clipboard on the very left right there under this render view window is the same button that's right here. So you can also just render by clicking this button right here as well, where my cursor is landing. So click this button and the scene will render out for a moment, and so we get this render. This is kind of the default render right here, and this isn't very good. It's there's no shadows being cast, and that default light is lighting up the scene, and we don't want that because we're going to set up our own lights, and this light is just not a very visually interesting light, and it's going to get in the way and mess things up here. So what I'm going to do is disable that right here. And so this is under the render settings tab. So just to recap, all we've done so far is we've gone up here where this gear is and hit the render settings button. We have changed it from Arnold Render, which was the default, to Maya software. That's the first thing of three that we've done. We go down here to where it says image size, and we change that to just a higher setting than the default. HD 1080 is what I'd recommend here. And then finally, we went to the very bottom under render options and disabled this default light. So those are all the options we need to change on that first Common tab. And then under this Maya software tab, there's two settings that we need to change before we get started with lighting. So we click on that tab. The first thing you want to do is under anti-aliasing quality, this very first tab up here, there are these presets, and the custom quality setting that they have there, it's kind of like a preview quality. It's just not very good, and so we're just going to change this to production quality, and it's going to change all the settings down here to something that'll produce better results here. So if we click production quality, all those settings will change. So we just changed the setting to production quality there. And then, so that's the first thing. And then the second thing is we want to go down to ray tracing quality. And whenever you see ray tracing in Maya, what that essentially means is shadows. So we want to click open ray tracing quality, and we just want to enable ray tracing so that when we render and we have lights in the scene, they will now cast shadows. So there are 5 things that we changed there total. And after doing that, all those steps that I just showed, we're ready to close. And I'm going to go ahead and save the scene. And one nice thing here is once you save the scene after changing those settings are now locked into the project. So you don't, if you close Maya one day and then you pick it up again, open up this project again the next day, those settings will still be there. So now that the render settings are changed, we're ready to create some lights. So the way that you create lights is really simple. You just go up here to the very top where my cursor is, where it says create. Then you go to lights, and then there's 6 options here. One thing that you can do in Maya is this little spot here where my cursor is, there's these double dotted lines right there. If you click on that, it'll break out the window. And so what that does is it just makes it so I can just drag the window over here instead of going up to create lights and finding the lights every time. It just kind of makes things a little quicker if you'd like. So there are 6 kind of lights. The first light is ambient light, which is exactly the same pretty much as that default light that was in the scene at the very beginning. I'm going to move past that one here. The directional light is the first one that shows up. This is like sunlight in a lot of ways here. So I clicked it and you see these little green arrows showed up. So I'm going to go over here and press this move tool, transpose tool, to get these arrows here to pull it up. The shortcut for that is W. And some shortcuts, if you're going to remember any shortcuts in Maya, what you want to remember is to press Q for select, which is right here. That selects an object, you know. So I have Q pressed, and it just helps me select objects. And the move tool is W, which is right next to Q, and that helps you move it. E is rotate, which is this button right here, and it lets you rotate the object. And then this button right here is scale, which is which is R. And those are all right in a row, so you just tab through them real quick. And I just kind of usually have either my left hand there or over the option button, which is the button you hold to rotate your perspective around. Right? So I'm holding down option right now, and I'm left clicking and rotating the object this way, or rotating the camera this way. If I press the middle mouse button, these 4 arrows will show up on your cursor, and you can drag it this way. And then if you right click on your mouse and drag left to right, you'll zoom in and out of an object. And then one last shortcut that I like a lot is if you press F, you'll focus on whichever object is selected. And once you press F with an object selected, now when I press option and do that left click drag around, it stays focused on that object the whole time. And so it's just a good way to kind of find your bearings and be able to rotate your around your scene in an easy way. So with that recap out of the way, if you recall, we went up to create lights, and I broke out this tab before and brought it down, and so we have our 6 lights here, and we had created this directional light. And so this directional light is it's a little hard to explain. It's like sunlight, and it's an infinite light. And what that means is if you create this one light in your scene, no matter how large your scene is, no matter if it's just this giant mountain landscape or something that we create out here, that one light will be able to light the whole scene because it's basically light emanates out in the direction that these arrows are pointing infinitely, all the way out to this way where the cursor is moving, all the way out to this way. It's just a uniform light coming from the direction that these arrows are pointing. And so I'm going to position this light like this, and the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to find the attribute editor. Depending on which mode you're in, the attribute editor might show up a little bit differently. I'm in the modeling standard mode, and so the attribute editor is right here. Sometimes for some of you, it might show up somewhere along here if you're not seeing it. So the attribute editor, when you find it, and you want to find the tab here that looks like this, is attribute editor adjust the attributes of whatever object you have selected. So right now I have the light selected, that directional light that we created, and this changes the settings of that light. Similar, if you select this object, the cylinder right here, the attribute editor is still up, and you can now control the attributes of that object. So with the light selected, there are only a few controls that we need to worry about here. So the first one, which you'll see right here, is the color. So this changes the color of the light. By default, it'll be set on white. If I change the color, I'll change it to red here. You just click here, and you'll have these color controls, and just familiarize yourself with this. It's once you mess with it, it makes sense pretty quickly. This box right here, if I have it in the left corner, that's white. If I drag it all to the white, that's a completely, fully saturated bright red right there. And then if we want it darker, we pull it up this way. And so if we pull it up into this corner, it'll be like a desaturated dark color. And then if you want to change the color, you just drag this hue wheel around and change the color of the light. And you can kind of continue to make adjustments here. On the computers at school here, sometimes an error message will show up. I'm doing this demo on my home computer, so it's not going to happen here. But sometimes when you double click this, an error message will show up. Just press yes, and if it keeps showing up for you, press yes again, and eventually you'll kind of get through and get to this menu here. So this is where you change the color emanating from the light. This is the intensity of the light. So if you drag it to a low setting, it's going to be completely dim. You can see a preview there. 1 is the default, which is a good place to start. And you might, depending on your scene, want to bump it up to 2 or 3 for the directional light, just depending. So it's only these two controls that you need to worry about right now for that section. Next is shadows. So if we click that shadows tab, here you can change the color of the shadow that's being cast by the light. You can make it less dark and make some adjustments there if you'd like. We're going to just leave it as is for now. This next tab is depth map shadow attributes, which we don't care about. That's not going to affect us. And finally, under here, for the directional light, we have the light angle, shadow rays, and ray depth limit. Shadow rays and ray depth limit at the bottom are going to change the quality of the light's render settings right here. And I'll get into light angle here. So for now, I'm just going to press render and see what we get with this scene here. Sorry. And so for that, I had just pressed this button right here. If you want to pull up this window that I have right here, you press this one with the eyeball button. So really either of those buttons works okay. If you press that eyeball button, you just need to click this render button right here to render the current frame. And so right here, these are some pretty predictable results that we got. By default, we got some pretty hard shadows there, and the light's red. And you can see that the reason that this light is not hitting that wall, you know how I said it was like an infinite light before, is that it is, if you look at it from the top view, it is parallel to that wall. So if I angle it in this way, it'll light, since it's an infinite light and it's being projected out, it will hit any surface that it's aimed at. And so if I render again, and I press this one with the eyeball on it to pull up this window, and I render one more time, you'll see that that wall, when this render comes up, is now lit. So this directional light is really good for emulating sunlight. That's kind of the best thing it is for. It can also create really hard, nice shadows if you're going for like a comic book look or something like that. So let's take a moment and look at this render view tab. So up here, there's a few buttons that we want to take a look at here. So this is the render the current frame. This is keep image. So if you press that after you press a render, take a look, keep your eye on this tab right here that my cursor is standing over. So if I press that keep image button, which is like the landscape with the greenish blue line around it, tap that, and now that image is saved. And I'd saved a previous image as well. And so it's just a way to temporarily save your images in your Maya scene, so you can just compare your progress as you position your lights and figure out what you want in your scene. These images right now are not permanently saved on your computer. It's just temporarily saved right now so that you can compare. So we have the render button right here. We have the keep image button right here. And then next up, what we have is this button right here and this setting right here. So what this is it's the color space that the image renders out as. And so there's different kinds of color space, and I don't want to jump too much into it, but basically by default, Maya has a very flattering setting in terms of how the images appear. That's not actually accurate to what we're doing. It's something I wish that they would change here. And so what we want to do is we just want to go to this tab, and if you change that to raw, you see how this got dimmer when I click that? That's actually more accurate. So if I know it doesn't look as good, but even if you have it set on that original setting and you export to Photoshop, the image is, when you open it in Photoshop, it's actually going to look like this. So we might as well just change the setting to be what it's going to look like in the end, right? So if you just change that to raw, that'll be good. You can also just click this button off, and it just kind of turns off that color space option altogether, and that'll produce pretty much the exact same result. So it's your choice there. I will just have it in raw, and now our render images will be accurate here. So the next light I want to show is, so I'm going to delete this directional light. What I want to show is the spotlight. And so the spotlight, if you click it, it creates a spotlight. It's kind of like a flashlight in the way it works. I press W, or press this button to move it around, and then I press T, and that's a shortcut that lets you aim it. And so if you look here, after I press T, we get this control where we can just set the light to aim here. And so this is going to be, if you review my 3-point lighting technique, this aim right here could be like the key light if we wanted. And so you can just kind of aim your light in a really specific way there. And so that's what these spotlights are good for, is you can just really aim them here. So you'll notice I created the spotlight, I positioned it where I wanted it. And in the attribute editor over to the right, we have all these settings. Without changing any settings here other than the color, and I'll make this one green, just a bright green so we can see what it's doing. If I don't change any of these settings, the render will look like this. So if you look there, and I'm going to keep this image, so I'll just have it for later reference. It created an incredibly sharp line around the edge there. And then again, there's this incredibly sharp shadow right there. And so that can be good if that's what you're aiming for, but particularly this outside circle is kind of silly looking. And so in order to change that, we need to, in this light, change the light settings. And so there's 3 controllers on the spotlight. There's the cone angle, so you can make it wider or more narrow. And then there's penumbra and drop-off angle. And so if you look at this preview that my cursor is hovering over right now, that's a preview of what that outside light edge is going to look like. And so as you adjust these, particularly the drop-off, just a little bit goes a long way, where we've now created a nice gradient there, and you just kind of move these 2 controls kind of relative to one another in concert to get it the way you want. And so now that I've changed that to be more of a drop off, more of a natural look, let's try this again. And so I will render again, and you'll see now, I kind of zoomed in a little too close there, but you can see around the edges there's not that hard line anymore. It's more of a gradual drop off that happens. And so that's a nice effect right there. Now if you look at this render right now, just keep an eye out, like there's not, it's rendering okay, like there's not any aliasing dots that you might see later, and so just take a note of that. So the next thing we want to do is we want to soften the shadow right here, or see how we can soften that shadow. And so in order to do that, we need to, again, under the spotlight, under the attribute editor of the spotlight, with the settings that we just changed right here, we just scroll down, back under that shadows menu, and again, just like before, we're going to go down and find the ray trace shadows. So if we have that disabled, the shadow is going to disappear. That'll turn the shadow off for that particular light. So we want that on. And so here, you'll notice that the light radius is set at 0. The light radius, if it's really small, if you think about a flashlight is a really small light, and if you shine a flashlight, it's going to cast a really hard shadow. On the opposite side, if you take a large light with a large diffuser on it, with a big surface area like a large light, it's going to cast really soft shadows. And so I'm just going to pump up that light radius setting here, and it'll soften the shadow. So we'll try this again. I'm going to zoom out a little bit so that we can see the scene a little bit better, and then render again. And so now, if we look, I'm going to keep this image. If you look in this shadow here, oops. And if you press Option, hold down Option, and then you use your mouse wheel, you can zoom in and move around your image here. So if you look in this area right here, there's a lot of dots, but the shadow is much softer than it was before. And so we're going to fix those dots in a moment. But if we compare this by, remember how we kept images before, if I can get this smaller. We kept images before, and if I toggle this over, so that was the render that we did before when the light radius was set at 0, when the light was like a really small light source. physically in terms of its light radius, the shadow is really sharp. And then when we boost it up the light radius, that shadow softens out right there. And so in order to get rid of these dots that we're seeing right here, what we need to do is go back into this attribute editor where we've been this whole time changing settings. So we changed the light radius right there. And I'm just going to change this. I usually change this to 4 and 6. You don't have to use those exact numbers. That's just kind of where I start off when I'm kind of fiddling with these settings to kind of get them better. So I'm going to boost the shadow rays and the ray depth limit to 4 and 6. And so the higher these numbers, the better quality your render is going to be. The trick is that you just need to not boost them up too much, because this will crash your computer if you pump them up too high, because Maya will just push your computer too hard and it'll cause Maya to crash. So I'm going to go back to the render view here by clicking the button with the eyeball on it. And instead of rendering the whole scene again, I'm going to show you how to do the render region. And so to use this render region button, all you do is before you press it, before you do that, I just take the cursor and then I drag it. So there's a dotted line at first, and then I let go and it'll become red. And now when I click this button where my cursor is now, it's only going to render what's in that box. And so the advantage of that is your render time will go a lot quicker and your computer will be a whole lot less likely to crash. And so this is really good to use when you're just trying to problem solve small areas, I'm just trying to get rid of the dots in this region. So I'm adjusting the settings and only rendering that region right there. You'll notice that it pops back out, and that was because I had zoomed in before. So I'll zoom back in here. And if you compare outside the box to inside the box, it's beginning to improve here. And I'm also zooming in a lot here, so that's pretty unforgiving. And so what you'll want to do, especially as you get closer to exporting your final image, you'll just want to keep adjusting those settings right there to get these shadows looking a little more smooth and less grainy here. There is the point light, which emanates out in every direction. And so if I take this object and move it there, oops, this point light's like a little sphere right there. And so all this light is it's just a light where it just comes out every direction. So if I put it right here, it's going to be a little bit like a campfire was placed between this object right here and this object right here. So let me pull it up just a little bit off the ground and then do another render here. This is going to be, I kept the color white, so this will be more of a natural light coming from this one. And you'll see here that if you look off to the sides, that it's just casting in every direction here. Sorry, I'm just having to adjust my screen some. And so those shadows are hard right there because we haven't changed that light radius setting, right? So if we want those shadows soft on this light, and this is the same for every kind of light, is we go over to the attribute editor of the light, go down to shadows, go down to ray trace shadows. Those are the kinds of shadows we're using, and then we'll change that to a larger number. And now when we render, those shadows will be softer here. And you see that these shadows are really pretty ugly looking with the aliasing right there. And so if you remember, it's those same controls: shadow rays, ray depth limit, 4 and 6 just as a starting point. You can try 6 and 8 as well. And if we want to get rid of the shadow, that aliasing, I'll do a render region here. So I'll just draw out a box in a little region here. and then just press this button here and see if changing those settings improved it. And you can see there in that little box that the settings, it got a little bit better there. And so you just kind of continue to nudge it up and see what your computer is able to do. Similar to this point light is the volume light. And remember, I'd gone up earlier and I'd done create lights, and I'd broken out this menu down here. So this volume light is much like the point light, except it's almost exactly the same, except for, and you see that little point right there is the point light, but then this sphere that you see coming out of it is the region in which light is going to emanate out of the light. And so if I put the sphere up here and that sphere isn't touching anything, this scene is going to be black. It's not going to light anything. So I just need to scale this up to be a larger setting there. And I have that light in between these two objects, so the light is emanating out from that point. And when I render it, it'll look like this. And so it's a lot like a point light. This is one I tend to use a little bit more, but that's just a personal preference right there. So next, and finally, we're going to go over, and so that was the volume light. I skipped from the point light down to the volume light. So finally is the area light, which is a lot like the spotlight. And so the area light, when you click it, it's going to make this little square, this little pan here. And it's a lot like the spotlight where you aim it. You can tell where it's aiming by this little line where my cursor is going right there. That indicates where it's aiming. So if I press T, just like I did before with the spotlight, I can use that to help aim it to an object. The geometry on this cylinder is a little low, so for ideal render settings I would probably smooth that to get rid of some of the faceting on there. Just FYI, that's pretty low geometry there. So anyway, for the area light, we can change the color here. I'll make this blue, and again, you can make it a more subtle color. Here, I'll just show, like you can drag it to there to get a more subtle blue rather than pumping it up all the way. The area light, you need to bring the intensity up on this one a bit more. It's just not quite as powerful by default as some of the other lights. And so I'm gonna bump this up to maybe 20. And now to the shadows, you'll notice on this light, the area light, that there's not a light radius control here as there were in the other lights. And the reason for that is for this particular light, you just scale it to change the light radius. So if I have it small like that, then it'll cast a very tight, sharp shadow. And if I make it large like that, it's going to cast a much softer shadow. And so I'm going to go ahead and just start off with 4 and 6 as my settings here, just to kind of get some of that aliasing out of the render there. So now if I just press the render view button and then render it out, you'll see that it kind of casts some nice soft shadows there. Back to the area light, I'm going to go and create a 3-point lighting scheme here. And so the 3-point lighting is, so this is our main light. This light is doing most of the work for us. And now I'm going to create a fill light, which I'm going to aim into the shadows. And so that fill light, I'm going to try to aim right there and right there to just make it so that that area is more defined and it's not in pitch black. And so for this example, I'm going to create a spotlight and just press W to get it so that I can move it around. And you can rotate it. And again, that's these buttons over here. And then if you press T, this is a good example of when you really want to aim a light, because I know exactly where I want that light to aim there. Oops. And the perspective view can kind of lie to you a little bit, right? That's a reason why it's good sometimes to click this button to go to the orthographic view, where you see these 4 views. And so now I'm looking at the top view up here. I can just aim it there. Oops. And select my spotlight again to get back into shape here. Then I go into the side view. This is technically the front view that I'm in down here. And so now that light is perfectly aimed. And now I'm just going to change the direction of it so that it is at a better angle. So I'm going to be rendering, so the camera is going to be I'm going to be rendering from around this region, right? And so the key light I'm going to put off to one side here. And then the fill light, the second light, I'm going to put off to one side, kind of like that. And now I'll go into this light settings. So with that light selected, I'm going to find the attribute editor, and I'm going to change some of these settings. So I'm going to change the color, and this is mainly so you can see what this light is doing for the scene. If every light was white, it would be hard for you guys to tell exactly what each light is contributing to the scene. So I'm going to try to make them a different color just to help with that. So I'm going to change that to fuchsia. I'm going to increase the cone angle a little bit. If you look at this, this is a preview of what that outer rim of the light's going to do. So I'm going to give it a little drop off and change the penumbra angle to give it more of a natural look here. And then under shadows, just like we were doing before with all the other lights, we're going to scroll down to ray tracing shadows, and I'm going to boost up the light radius so that it casts soft shadows. But with soft shadows, you have to increase the settings here. So I'm just going to boost up these settings. And whenever I boost up the settings like there, I just save, because you just never know when Maya's going to crash, particularly after you change these settings to increase your render quality. So I'm going to try another render here with that fill light placed, and there's going to be a lot of trial and error here usually when you try this out. So rendering it here, you can see the render's taking a little bit longer here. Those softer shadows are a little more taxing on the computer, and now there's 2 lights to be computed. And so you can already see how the main light, that area light that I first created, had a kind of a more subtle blue tone to it. And then this fill light I have with a more drastic purple color to it. And you can kind of see what that fill light is doing here. The placement on this isn't perfect, but we're kind of beginning to see it define the space a little bit better. So the main point of 3-point lighting is that it just kind of increases the 3-dimensionality of things a little bit. And what I'm going to want to do here is my fill light is overpowering my main light right now, both in color and in strength. And so I'm going to just make an adjustment here. And this is a big part of lighting a scene, is you're just kind of placing lights and making adjustments here. I'm going to go into my main light, and I'm just going to boost up the saturation here so that it's not getting it's badly overpowered from saturation point. And then on the secondary light, I repositioned it some, and I'm just going to take the intensity down a little bit. I'm going to decrease it by 1/4 here and see what we get. So if we render again, I'm going to keep that image just so we'll be able to compare. So now we have our secondary light in place. And so I'm going to keep that image, and using the slider you can just kind of compare your progress as you move along. So that was our starting point, and you can see I was just showing some different kinds of lights here, and you can kind of see things progress as you do the slider and do some nice comparisons. So now I'm going to add the rim light, which is just going to add like a little accent on the back of these. And so for the rim light, you can use virtually any light here. The volume light could be an interesting one. I like to use the directional light. And the reason I like to use the directional light is, so this floor is flat, completely flat to the ground. And so for that directional light, as long as I keep it perfectly parallel to that floor there, it won't light the floor at all. And this rim light, all I'm trying to do with it is just get a little bit of an accent on this thing. And so I'm just going to rotate it by doing this yellow rotation knob, and just keep it. If you just only grab that yellow, it's not going to go up or down, and so it's just going to stay perfectly flat. And I'm going to keep this light white here for this. And I'm going to place it behind the camera, and so you can kind of see why this is called 3-point lighting, right? We got our main light here doing most of the work. We have our fill light here, kind of defining the shadows of the main key light. And then this rim light is kind of back here in a support role, helping add that third dimension. And for this rim light, I'm going to leave shadows on at first and see what that looks like. Sometimes I like to turn the shadows off on that rim light. And the reason for that is if you have too many lights casting shadows in your scene, it seems like that would be counterintuitive to turn shadows off, but it can make the scene become pretty busy if you have every single light casting shadows, particularly if you start adding more and more lights here. So we're going to render here with the rim light on. I kind of changed the angle of the camera here a little bit by mistake. Keep that image. If you can compare, it's not doing much yet. I need to change the angle of it a little bit. And so the rim light is another one where you're just kind of making some adjustments here. And that brings me to a good place here, which is creating a camera. Because every time I'm rendering, I'm changing the angle here with the perspective view. And that's not necessarily what we want. And so you can certainly render out of the perspective view if you'd like. But for the best results, I like to render out of a camera. So I go to Create, Camera, and then Camera. Whenever you create an object, if you just go up to Create, go to Create up here first, and you'll be able to find it eventually here. So Camera, and you can position the camera. Right now, I can't view through the camera's viewfinder, which is not what we want. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to go to panels, perspective, and camera. And so that's going to change our view here in this main view to the camera rather than that default perspective view. So camera, and so now I can move the camera just the same way I was doing the perspective view with the same exact buttons and all that. And so here you can set up the camera the way you like. You can change the focal length right here, which the higher the number, the flatter and more focused on the objects it's going to be. So if we 50 is a good one, I feel like. If you want a wide angle, you can kind of go more to 24, and that will exaggerate the perspective a little bit more. And then if you want the perspective de-emphasized, if you go to 85, you'll see that the camera zoomed in a whole lot, which is what happens when you increase the focal length, but space gets flattened here. So if you want something a little more flat and focused, 85 might be what you want. For this, I'm going to do 50, and I'm going to just set up the camera real quick. Since this is a demo, we're not going to be getting this perfect. Let's just say that this is exactly where we want the camera to be. You can press this little button right here, and it locks the camera in place. So it's just the second small icon, just the small one up to the left with the lock on it. You press that, and now you can't move the camera, and it's locked in place. And then later, if you decide you want to move it again, you just press it again and unlock it. And so it's just a quick way to move here. So lock that camera, and so now I can start to hone in on exactly what I want to do. I'm going to turn off, so I'm working on the rim light right now. I'm going to turn off the ray trace shadows, and I'm going to change the color to bright green, just so when I see bright green, I know that's that light doing the work there. So I'm going to render again. And so you'll see what happened here is this is not the view we're expecting, right? And so what happened is it's rendering from the perspective view, and we want it to render from the camera view that we just set up. And so in order to do that, you need to go to render, render, and then choose the camera here. And again, this view here, right, is the eyeball render view. So click that eyeball render view thing, go up to here to render, and then choose the camera, and then it'll automatically render from that place. And so from here, you can see that the rim light is adding that little streak of light right there just to kind of define that edge. And you can see a little bit of it hitting right here. And so that's kind of what the rim light's bringing. It's really subtle, but it just kind of helps fully realize the scene a little bit more under the 3-point lighting scheme. Okay, so with the render finished here, the last step is relatively simple. So we just go to render the render view window, and we go to File, Save Image, and this will want to go into the Images folder, what you're working on. You can experiment with different formats here. JPEG's actually not too bad, but I would just experiment here and just name it. And once you're done there, if you just direct back to that folder where you find it, your image will be there and ready to open in Photoshop.